Bethany. Okay, so my first question would be this. When people walk into the show, they kind of see the floor drawing that I've got, and they kind of see it as the foundation for the show, right? It's the thing that's on the floor. A lot of things are touching it. But in my experience, in my understanding, that's the foundation of this show came out of a conversation between you and Dieter. And that's sort of where I first heard about it. So part of me is I'm curious how that conversation went, what it was like, talking about a conversation about work. Is the work that you have in the show is untitled Erased, right? It's a photograph of chalk dust. It's like 42 by 42 framed, right? Is that work what you were thinking of initially when we were talking about making the show, or was it something else? And generally also, how do you think about the idea of work as it relates to your own practice in relationship to the show? Big question, I know, but you know.
Questions. Dieter and I had a really lovely studio visit. Is this 2024? So this was 2023. And talking about ideas of labor and work. I think of my practice as oriented towards repetition and tedium. I know it's getting good when I'm repeating something ad nauseum until it transforms. So that's my own vantage point towards the labor. I don't think we picked the work in that initial visit.
Yeah.
It actually is a work, the piece in the show is from 2012, 2013. So it's, are you going to cut this part out where I just got really silent?
It's
Unrelated.
That's the word.
It's erased, unrelated.
Erased,
so
unrelated.
It's a piece that I made really close to after grad school.
Yeah.
And the show allowed me to kind of think back towards that process and the tentacles of all of those early works that are still in the current. But I actually think, that chalk dust piece is a kind of aftermath of labor and tedious, laborious, repetitive processes.
Yeah.
I think what's nice about the pairing of these works and the grounding of your work in the show is that it's the revealing of the process. Mm-hmm. You never get to see the performance by which my works are made. Mm-hmm. You have to trust that they were incredibly obsessively preoccupied with something. But the evidence of that is not always visible, and you're making it quite visible.
Yeah.
In the first 2 weeks of the show, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You want to talk about that? The process of making that or overseeing the making of it?
Sure. Briefly. I'll be as brief as I can. So for the show, it's one of the things I put in is a floor drawing. It's the thing that's on the floor. Typically, when those things are made, they're made prior to the show opening. I've been making those things for about 13 years. This is the 11th version of this. And it's the first time we started making this drawing on the same day that the show started. So, which presents a lot of issues for a lot of reasons. The main reason why I agreed to do this is because I knew I would be able to spend time with and hang out with Devin, who agreed to be a part of this and agreed to sort of be in that space and activate my work and his work at the same time, which definitely made it easier for me to consider, all right, from a conceptual standpoint, I'm just not doing this out of some sense of just whatever. There's some kind of, there's an imperative here, there's a requirement that needs to be met to a certain degree. And so that made it easier. And it was an idea that I brought to Dieter. Dieter said, this seems like a great idea, let's try it and see if it fails. But I think ultimately, the first couple of weeks were basically, let's start this process. We did some prep work prior, but essentially the moment that the show opened is the moment that we put graphite to the floor. And then the show had begun, where your work was actually just outside the space. Ellen's work was installed right out here in the courtyard. And so there was a presence of everybody around. It was just sort of in this deconstructed sort of way.
Yeah.
That made way for this kind of process of just straight up labor that I don't want to call performative. Because to me, what we were doing is just making a drawing, but I can't deny the context of how performative work and performance in general might be a part of that conversation. But to me, it was just this is what we have to do to make a drawing.
Yeah.
And so I had 2 weeks as part of a show to make a drawing and put that, shed some light on that, give some eyes on that, and have it be something that people can see and experience and kind of be confused about.
Can I ask 2 follow-ups? I have 2 follow-ups.
Sure.
Why Devin's work? What felt urgent to be in conversation with for this show? And then why do you resist, because I do as well, any performative, like even I get a lot of questions about, you should, because it's so labor-based, you should do this as a performance. And I will never.
Right.
I will never. So why do you resist it?
Right.
Never.
Well, the first question, Devin, because he's from Detroit.
Okay.
That's the only reason.
That's not.
That's a good reason.
That's not the only reason. But no, there's an absolute. I have a tremendous amount of respect and awe and wonder around Devin's work.
Yeah.
The ease with which that he's able to kind of go in and out of context, go in and out of work, perform work, do work, not perform work, and it still appears has weight, stage, not stage. There's a real beauty to that.
Yeah.
That it's more of a reality to his life. And for me, I have a huge separation between art and reality. So I don't really enjoy the idea of art making in a performative sense because performance is too close to reality for me. So Devin's interesting because he's able to create a world of art making that encapsulates both of these things simultaneously, seamlessly. And so that kind of answers both questions, I think. Yeah. I don't know. Devin could hate all this.
No, it's just interesting hearing kind of like everybody's kind of introduction to the work, the practice, and the show. It's funny, I'm thinking about when I first met Bethany. I think I just finished grad school, actually.
Yeah.
This is like 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
Wow. And remembering that work that's in the show, you actually presenting on it at a lecture at the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Chicago. And then I think I met Tony just a few years before that, I want to say. And then Ellen's somebody that I met because of Dieter's introduction, like knew of you and the work. And so the actual conversations about how all things kind of came together, I was imagining for a long time, like how things would look, but I didn't know how they would be. Yeah. And I think when Tony had reached out, I was in town from Texas for a couple of days. And I think the thing that Tony was really interested in was like, I really would like your work to kind of like engage with mine in a more kind of like direct physical way. And the thing that I thought was the most interesting about that was, and we spoke about this during that time, was there are very few opportunities for artworks to be able to like touch each other in a very specific way. And I really, really was open to being like, what happens when I give away kind of, not even give away, but the concern is actually kind of a shared not shared space in a kind of institutional, practical way, but kind of like we have similar stakes, which is the ground, which is the floor. And that really got me excited. And the idea of kind of like simultaneous work. So the thing that I said to Tony was, while you're prepping for the floor drawing to be made, I could be prepping outside for things to come inside at some point. And maybe not everything, but maybe, there can be kind of this like ongoing things happening, which you don't need a kind of, things are always happening simultaneously, I guess. But I think it was nice to have an exhibition as a kind of like, as a guide, maybe, to offer some sort of kind of like, to know kind of like where to situate maybe the happening that's happening all the time. And that's how the pallets became part of the work. It was,
I see you looking at a blank space.
I know, I keep doing that.
because of what, the story around what happened to the pallets.
Sure.
It's literally in conversation with Ellen's work because they both occupy the same space at the same time. Like I said, in the talk, Ellen was smart enough to place the work to the wall and high enough so nobody could get to it.
That's true.
Whereas the pallets were sort of have their own. It's like one of the most interesting things about this exhibition happened outside of the gallery.
Yeah.
Given the state of the context and all that stuff, but it has to do with those pallets. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
No, sure. I can talk about it briefly. The idea that I had mentioned to both you and Dieter at the time, we hadn't spoken just yet about what work was going into the show, but I remember saying that there's this work with pallets that I'm really interested in, and I like to kind of source them from wherever kind of like the place I'm working. And so for about a week and a half, I would say I was just kind of going around Chicago trying to gather pallets. And it's a little more than like dumpster diving. It's kind of this asking for permission or an invitation to kind of gather these things.
Yeah.
So one of the things I would do is go to various buildings not too far from the Collegium, and I would see that there were like stacks of pallets inside some of these kind of more, I'll say kind of commercial buildings on campus. And so after kind of like a series of asks, I gathered the pallets, would drop them off, arrange them, stack them. And some of the arrangement and the stack was kind of, I want them to be there as if they're kind of prepared to do something, not being asked to do anything. So the kind of like even using things like shims or using wedges to kind of offer balance to the stack was important for me. And I remember the biggest thing we were talking about is like, well, would somebody know that there was art on the lawn? In which I was okay with that being a part of the work, having to deal with that. Like there's a good possibility someone might throw these things away.
Yeah.
I never had the idea that maybe they would be used, for an encampment. Not too far from campus. So I think when I got the phone call from Dieter after the small preview of the show opening, my expectation was actually that the facilities just came by and took everything. Not that they were being picked up and repositioned somewhere else for a different kind of purpose and use.
They were working in another way.
They were working in another way, which I found to be really quite interesting. 'Cause I had a mix of emotions being like, it is something to kind of like watch, the time that it takes to kind of like, some of these things were gathered in Houston, some of them were gathered here. And then like 5 days later for them to no longer be there. And so the markings of where they were became important for me. And I was actually working on a letter. I don't think I told anybody this. I was working on a letter that I was going to ask to be delivered to the people of the encampment. Nothing else to kind of just be in more direct dialogue with them as opposed to having this kind of passive, like something happened to these things and they just became something else. It's like, no, I'm actually happy if it makes me feel better to know that we are kind of in dialogue actually. And the letter was going to simply say that, would you be okay if I actually tell people the work has just been moved somewhere else, i.e. the quad? And the next morning I got an email and a text from Dieter kind of saying that the encampment had been raided and there's videos of the pallets being thrown away in the dumpster. And I had friends like looking in the dumpster to see if they can kind of identify and pull out the pallets, but then the dumpsters were being guarded. Fast forward, that's when actually Ellen had mentioned to me that she had pictures of some of the pallets from that moment. And it felt like kind of like the world around the work, which is how I describe usually kind of the practice. It's my things become ways to kind of like ground myself for other things to happen around the work. And this is no better example. I think probably the pallets were just a kind of like a way to enter this kind of discussion. And that's when you had said, hey, actually, I have pictures of the pallets if you want them. So, I don't know. I really appreciate that also is the life of the work. The extension of the work is kind of like the myth around if I saw the pallet or not, or when you saw the pallet, maybe you saw it here, maybe you saw it on the quad, but
Yeah.
I like that was actually like something you offer to the work too.
I saw it in the paper.
Yeah.
So it was in the New York Times.
Yeah.
Not listed as the work, but listed as something
It wasn't
else.
technically a review of the show,
Right,
but it was.
Right. All this shit is trash. Yeah, for sure. But it's interesting because I was thinking about how like photography works in your work actually. It's in the show right now and the kind of the documentation of the aftermath of kind of the exhibition.
Yes.
And it's interesting that what you found to be interesting was the aftermath of what happened to my work.
Yeah.
And so, if you could actually talk about how the documentation of the aftermath is kind of how that kind of came to be for the work that's in there right now.
Well, I think the first image that the first time I saw the pallets was in an image that Dieter sent me of Rick Lowe standing behind the pallets and speaking, like, or, you know,
Yeah.
in this kind of public salute.
Yeah.
And, you know, my own work is very public facing. And so I was happy for the opportunity, in addition to being, you know, in conversation with all of you, to be in conversation with a public that might be part of the institution, but also the larger community around the institution. So the idea of having work that was adjacent to the pallets,
Yeah.
and also was alongside the street was important to me.
The work boot banner you describing.
Yeah, the
that.
banner,
Yeah.
the work metric, the
Yes.
large boot.
Yeah.
And I think I was the last artist to be included, and I had come down to talk to Dieter about the Gelatin show, which I loved, and he mentioned Tony, and he mentioned all of you. And then I went to California and just coincidentally saw Tony's work at the Orange County Museum. And it made me think of an image that I had taken at MoMA of Kruger's, Barbara Kruger's large installation, which had happened at the Art Institute, but then had been reinstalled at MoMA. And I just happened to be there on that day, crossing the bridge over the atrium, and saw this mass of paper and dumpsters and forklifts and brooms. And I had just finished like a long kind of curatorial project on labor at the School of the Art Institute, where I was focused on issues of invisible labor. And I didn't think about that photograph as something I was going to print and show, but I was very intrigued with the silence of the image as it was there in the atrium, because Barbara Kruger's work is very loudly voiced, and it was very quiet, and there was no, all of the workers were on break. And I just was like, it was a moment. It was like a note to self. And so when Dieter came to my studio, I probably wouldn't have picked that image to show him, but I printed it, and yeah, he went for it.
Yeah.
Why not that image? I love that image.
I think it's the right
also
one.
Aftermath and residue.
It's like the right one in terms of
Yeah,
all
I
of
love
these
that image.
things, especially here you talk about it. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, so why not? Why weren't you thinking that one would work?
I think because I've been working on the fly a lot, because I've been moving around. So between Berlin and Chicago, and I shot it with my cell phone.
It's so good.
And so it's sort of this accumulation of notes to self. And then I went back, had some time, and I started just printing images. And there was something about it that just, it said, yeah, print me.
Yeah.
And I think, I saw Devin's performance at the Renaissance Society just weeks before the show.
Yeah.
And I was intrigued by the formality of the work, the benches, which were like minimalist sculpture, but also the sound, which was about a description of space. and everybody just was sitting and listening to a description of space. And Bethany, I encountered your work first in a show that we were in together during the pandemic. And I was very, intrigued by your use of language. And it was a huge opportunity to meet all of you and to be in a conversation with you in the show.
Likewise.
And, so I was like super excited by something that was going to happen quickly. It had a low budget and it had a certain kind of intimacy. You talk about the word touching each other, and I just thought it was like nothing. It wasn't like another group show that I had been in, and it was curious to me because I invited some colleagues, friends who are photography scholars, and their comment to me about the show was, "It's a sculpture show." And I was like, really? And then I kind of demanded an explanation, and there was this kind of long pause, and they said, it's like, it's an installation. All of the work is speaking to each other. And I think in addition to touching each other, that kind of production of a new work by touch, by adjacency, by these ideas coming together was something that really continues to compel me.
It's funny. It's like, I would say that even though, let's say, for example, like Bethany's work was the kind of like anchor for the show, it wasn't like literally touching the floor or the ground that became your floor drawing, but to activate the floor, the walls feel different. Mm-hmm. Like if the ground was just kind of the ground as it would be in the Neubauer, then I think the idea of things touching or having this other kind of intimate shared space would feel different. They were just kind of like 4 or 5 things that, were discrete art moments in the room.
Yeah.
But there's something about the floor that then made the wall feel like,
I mean, it was a messy process from the beginning.
Yeah.
When the show first was put up, it was just very, very haphazard.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of dispelled any idea of any sort of discreteness. It was like, no, you have to touch this.
Yeah.
You have to get in here, even if you want to try to get in here.
Yeah.
Because we had that barrier at the beginning of the show. There was a barrier where you could peek through, and if you really were, if you wanted to actually perform a little bit and help make the drawing, you could step through, cover yourself up, and then you rub the floor with a rag that's soaked in graphite powder.
Yeah.
So it's like that sets the stage already of a kind of cleansing in a lot of way, or a sort of like a reverse purification process.
Yeah.
It makes it so everything kind of has to touch. Bodies walking in there have to touch. It sort of sets that it makes it so everybody walking in there, no matter what, you're implicated already. Right. You're doing the thing you're not supposed to do in a show. You're touching the art. And there's nothing you can do about it because you're walking on it, because of gravity. Like, you cannot physically go to see the show without touching work.
I feel that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
You like that, yeah.
It's interesting to me because it's like, I think on a conceptual level, it gets to, I think what I like many things about it, but from the perspective of the audience, I think it's interesting to give, put forth an opportunity to participate in a really weird way. There's a sort of weird sense of participation. A lot of people walking in that space are like, oh, I'm helping you make this drawing. I'm like, you're not, but if you
Sure.
think you are, then that's great.
Right.
Because to a certain extent, there is a little bit of that, And I guess one of the things that I wanted to get to is, I don't know how much time we got left, but one of the things I did want to get to is sort of, if we can, because I feel like this is too big of a concept to show, the idea of work, the way that it sort of like might sort of manifests in 4 different ways is insurmountable, and it's like the way we've been talking, we've already done it, right?
Yeah.
We've described how work sort of falls into like our bodies of work a little bit, but if we could boil it down to like a few keywords or key phrases or ideas or like a couple sentences, what would that look like for each of us? If you, I know it's a tough thing, but maybe even use the show as an example.
I'm going to resist.
That's a great form of work. I think that's a great response. That's 100%. I get it.
Because you were talking about performance earlier, and I felt that what happened in the and this kind of goes back to one of Dieter's, his Hannah Arendt quote, and this idea of work, labor, action.
Yeah.
And because I feel like the reveal of the people working in hazmat suits with masks on and gloves on in the gallery for weeks, and it was available to people who came through this kind of porthole. I don't think that was trivial. I don't think it was performance. I think it was real labor, and it was labor with risk. And, then the flip side is it's been vacuumed. We have booties on, and we're kind of sliding across this beautiful surface and polishing it, which is maybe another kind of group labor.
Yeah. And,
the challenge of the Neubauer Gallery, I've seen so many great shows here, but it's like, who has a gallery, space or an exhibition space with a giant concrete mantle and these paneled walls? And, I was astonished by the power of Bethany's photograph to hold its own on that
100%,
wall.
yeah.
And I think the floor, did the same thing. And then these tiny gestures of the removed pallets, like the orange Post-it notes, became this like very, very subtle note to the removal, the absence that occurred throughout Devin's participation. And I think there's a lot of really strong ideas in the show.
Yeah, I agree.
No, you
got the last word.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, it's interesting. I think being in this show too has had me thinking a lot about being mindful of not using the words work and labor interchangeably, which I think happens often.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to sit with that a little bit, like what is work, what is labor, and maybe the only thing I can come up with at the moment is to say that, or suggest that maybe work is a formalized labor, in a sense that I think my body is always, there's a labor that is required for me to kind of like sit here and talk.
Yeah.
That I don't require, that I wouldn't call work.
Yeah.
But then there's a thing that I ask my body to do with a very specified intention that then begins to feel like work. So I would like to think that maybe the idea of works by is a kind of formalized labor that happens when you make a photograph, when you make a drawing, when you make a sculpture, when you kind of like carry things from one place to the other. But then there's this other labor that happens around the work that then kind of like informs, I would say, maybe kind of like whatever those formalized gestures are, or maybe they become another formalized gesture from that kind of like outside like labor that happens. Whether it's, I remember, it's funny you mentioned actually, like, Ellen, the idea of that every time I kept showing up, things kept disappearing. You know what I mean? It was actually kind of wild. It was like, I had pallets out here, and then it's like, damn, now the pallets are gone. And then when we moved the pallets after 2 weeks.
You had the imprint inside.
We had the imprint inside. And I remember Tony and I must have spent like 5 or 6 hours inside of the gallery being like, this is amazing that the marks from when we moved the pallets from one side of the room to the other left similar marks from when the pallets were removed for the use in the encampment. And then we were like, what do we do about that?
I don't think we got paid for that work session.
We were like, what do we do about that? Like, this is really beautiful and interesting.
Wow.
But like, you know, I don't make drawings. And Tony was like, well, this is actually something else on top of this drawing. It's not my drawing. So I don't fix things, but there's a possibility if you want this thing to stay, you might have to fix it because it's going to disappear. And so we had a long conversation about being like, all right, Devin, something else you made is probably going to disappear by the halfway point in the reception.
Yeah.
And I think it was actually kind of like, it became part of the conversation around like, the thing that Dieter kept getting at is like the effort that goes into something. And then the kind of like the evidence of that effort.
Yeah.
You know, is it tied up in the documentation? Is it tied up in the mythology of kind of the stories that we tell and retell?
Yeah.
Or having to just be okay with like something I make might disappear. No one will ever know it happened. And yeah, and I think some of the labor that happens from like the work that I make is actually having to deal with that. You know what I mean? That whatever the emotional, whatever the egotistical kind of like attachment I have to the work immediately kind of like has to be dealt with when I allow the labor outside of the work to happen.
Right.
You know?
So I'm often, I'm getting back to what you're saying by talking about myself. So I'm often creating a system of rules that I can follow so that I do not have to be conductor of the orchestra. I can abdicate what will happen, the formal outcome of the work. And I wonder if if there's some sort of like, I don't want the thing to exist beyond me, that you're actually finding pleasure in, a kind of satisfying.
That I do want the thing to exist or do not want
Don't, that you would actually like it all to disappear.
Oof. I think there is something for me that I feel good about knowing that it can disappear, actually. I think, and it's an interesting kind of like tension that it's like I can put a lot of care and want to live with the thing and also know that this thing may not be around for very long. You know what I mean? The thing that I make or like kind of the efforts of the work might not kind of exist much longer than they need to, whatever that time is, maybe not just up to me, but up to other things outside of me. But I think that helps me with like practice. It allows me to kind of like feel like I'm never worried about what to do next, actually. It feels like the fact that I know this thing can disappear, and maybe sometimes should, helps me to understand that it's not just my responsibility for this thing to exist here or elsewhere, which I think gives me a little bit more, makes me feel better about being in the practice and maybe kind of leaning away from kind of like being overly concerned with like exhibitionism. And it's like, it's very much a kind of like a practice about practice in a way. And so I think that's just actually kind of what like refuels the next kind of like motivation to like do something else or move something else maybe. Not for it to disappear, but to be like, I want this thing to be around. I also know it might disappear, which is like trying to hold space for both those things to be true. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
In your Libra way, it did. It did.
It's a very Libra thing of me to say. You're right. It's true.
I mean, I think the other thing that it really intrigues me is that there's a lot of formalism in everyone's practice.
Totally.
In this group. But there's also this kind of intrusion of, I mean, okay, you know, there was also, whether it's the layering of the work and what it does together, or the way in which the events from outside impacted what happened inside.
Yeah.
and the radicality of doing something quickly, very economically, and about process, revealed different aspects of everyone's work in a provocative way, I think.
Can I also just say I really like thinking about like dust when it comes to both of your work, actually.
No, I mean, yeah. We didn't even talk about that. But like,
Dust.
Dust. Like, I think I didn't...
And yours too, because of the shadow.
Yeah. I really... There's something about kind of the significance of like dust to me that feels really, really like interesting. In a way that I don't think I initially kind of anticipated to be like a thing that I was like thinking about in like a literal way. There's like literal dust in this room being kicked around. There's a picture of dust. Like dust actually doing a lot of work.
Dust was being vacuumed.
Dust was doing a lot of stuff in that show.
Toxic.
yeah.
Dust
You know what I
was-
mean? Like
Yeah, 100%.
it really, yeah. I don't know. I don't have like a kind of like a complete thought about it, but I like having to think about dust when thinking about work. That actually feels really, really good to me.
Yeah.
or
100%.
materiality.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, the materiality of everyone's work was, yeah.
Can I say something about Ellen's piece before we finish? The one on the back.
Oh, the
No, not the one on the back of the chair piece.
oh
On the
yes.
back of the Kruger piece. So the older I'm turning 40 this year, and the older I'm getting, talking about labor, the less I want to like wrestle with the gods for an idea that, or maybe angels, like pull it down from the heavens. I have less interest in that because that used to be my form of labor, the hardest thing I had to do. But I am still really enjoying, and this is where I think your piece on the back flips the script of how I'm thinking
Yeah.
about labor. I'm
Yeah.
still really enjoying, once the idea has come, the angels have kissed me with an idea, then my job is just to make, and my brain can go, "Phew," and my job and my pleasure is to just do the tedious thing over and over again. I think there's some kind of shared sensibility in that piece on the back, that it's not about the works that were made from the artistic life, it's the it's the life of the artist. It's not the heroic masterpieces that were made. It's the hours of reflection and probably frustration and wrestling with the gods for an idea, and then the ecstasy of when it comes, and then you start the whole fucking thing again. It's that. But the focus then, like the labor is not the work, it's the life. And I just am enjoying thinking about that piece.
100%. It reminds me of the wear and tear of the shoe
Yeah.
in the banner outside here. Like that was a work shoe, right?
Yes.
That was that has memory, because I think memory is like as a big part of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The repetition, to be able to sort of, but also just this kind of I love what you say about the idea of just pulling from the heavens versus just like being able to distill and just like do the work in a way that's like, all right, this is what my body has time for. This is what, and just the grinding out of that. But it also, to me, it reflects a little bit in the work that's outside, because it's such a clear indication of a sort of an object, of a moment, of a memory, of a history, private albeit, but it's still something that I see that wear and tear that you're discussing. I see it in both works.
Yeah, and I think that, there's one of Dieter's questions was around physical exertion, right, as labor. And of course, I saw it in the moving the pallets, where everyone was recruited, including Isidore, to hold a pallet as it was going through, and could someone lift it? You better help him. I don't think he could lift it. But I'm also thinking about all that time that we sit in whatever workspace we have, our studios, right? And we're just like looking. And I think this may be a pre-angel moment,
Yeah.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
But we're looking and we're looking and we're looking, and then We have to go out and take a walk because we can't look anymore, but then we come back and, so that kind of labor, what is that? It's something that we share in all different ways, and it's,
Yeah.